I want to tell you about a fire. One fire. The Great Chicago Fire, October 1871. You already know this story, or you think you do. A cow kicks over a lantern, a wooden city burns, 300 people die. The city rebuilds better than before. This is the story we inherited. This is the story in textbooks and Wikipedia entries and documentary films narrated by respected historians. I had no reason to question it. I was researching 19th century urban architecture when I found myself looking at before and after photographs of Chicago's commercial district, trying to understand how a city could transform so completely in such a compressed timeline. I was interested in the buildings, not the fire. The fire was just context, background, a known event requiring no investigation. But something in the photographs began to disturb me. The speed of transformation, the uniformity of what replaced what had burned. And then I found Peshtigo. This is where the first question emerged, the question that changed everything I thought I was looking at. On the same night, the Great Chicago Fire began, October 8, 1871. Another fire ignited approximately 250 miles north in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. This fire killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people in a single night. Some estimates place the death toll higher. The Peshtigo Fire remains the deadliest fire in American history. It burned over 1 million acres. Entire towns vanished. Bodies were found fused to tree roots, bones calcified in positions of flight. The heat was so intense that sand turned to glass. And yet most people have never heard of Peshtigo. Why does the smaller fire dominate our historical memory, while the larger catastrophe remains obscure? This was my first question, and I did not have an answer. I still do not have an answer. But this question led to another question, and that question led to a pattern, and the pattern led to something I cannot fully explain. The same night. Remember that. October 8, 1871. Chicago burns, Peshtigo burns, but there is more. On that same night, fires erupted across the entire Great Lakes region. Holland, Michigan burned. Manistee, Michigan burned. Port Huron, Michigan reported significant fires. Across Wisconsin and Michigan, multiple population centers experienced catastrophic fire events within a window of hours. The official explanation involves drought. The summer of 1871 was exceptionally dry. So timber operations had left vast quantities of slash and debris across the landscape. The conditions for fire existed. No one disputes this. But conditions for fire are not the same as simultaneous ignition across hundreds of miles. Drought explains fuel. Drought does not explain synchronicity. What ignited these fires at the same time? The conventional answer is that it was not the same time, not precisely, that these were independent events that merely clustered due to shared environmental conditions. Perhaps this is true. Perhaps coincidence explains what I was seeing. I wanted to believe this. It would have made my research simpler. But I kept finding more fires. The newspaper coverage from October 1871 is fragmentary but illuminating. Local papers across the Midwest reported fires in language that shifts noticeably over the following weeks. Initial reports describe confusion, chaos, uncertainty about the origin and scope of events. Later reports become more uniform. The narrative crystallizes. A cow, a lantern, an accident. But the early reporting does not mention the cow. The O'Leary cow story does not appear in Chicago newspapers until days after the fire, and its origin remains unclear. A reporter named Michael Ahern later claimed he invented the story. Whether this is true or whether Ahern was attempting to correct an injustice done to the O'Leary family, the effect is the same. The origin story we inherited may be a fabrication layered onto events after the fact. This does not mean the fire was not accidental. It does not mean anything definitive. But it introduces a question about how we know what we think we know about this event. As I continued researching, I began to notice patterns in the rebuilding. Chicago's reconstruction happened at extraordinary speed. Within 2 years, the burned district had been almost entirely rebuilt. But it was not simply rebuilt. It was transformed. Building codes changed. Construction materials changed. Property boundaries shifted. Streets were widened. The elevation of entire sections of the city was raised. The chaos of organic urban growth was replaced by something more ordered, more uniform, more modern. Historians describe this as evidence of Chicago's resilience and ambition. The fire was a tragedy that enabled progress. This framing appears across accounts of urban fires throughout history. Destruction enables renewal. Catastrophe enables modernization. I began to wonder whether this framing was descriptive or prescriptive, whether we observed this pattern in history or whether we constructed this pattern to make sense of events that might otherwise resist explanation. I want to pause here to acknowledge what I am not saying. I am not claiming that the Great Chicago Fire was deliberately set. I am not claiming that a coordinated network of arsonists moved across the American Midwest in October 1871. I am not claiming conspiracy as fact. I am noting patterns. I am noting questions. I am noting the gap between what we are told and what the evidence suggests. If you find these patterns unpersuasive, that is reasonable. If you find these questions unnecessary, that is your prerogative. But I could not stop looking, and looking led me beyond the American Midwest. In the same year, 1871, significant urban fires occurred across multiple continents. Constantinople experienced a catastrophic fire that destroyed large sections of the city. The district of Pera burned extensively. This fire is documented in diplomatic correspondence and insurance records from the period. Across South America, reports exist of forest fires and urban fires in 1871 that coincide roughly with the October events in North America. The documentation for these events is less complete. Record-keeping varied widely by region and by colonial administration. What exists is fragmentary. What does not exist may have been lost, destroyed, or never recorded. The absence of documentation is not evidence, but the pattern of absence itself becomes difficult to ignore when you see it repeat. Consider the question of insurance. Fire insurance as an industry underwent significant transformation in the years following 1871. The losses from the Chicago fire alone bankrupted dozens of insurance companies. New companies formed. Regulations changed. The entire structure of urban fire insurance was rebuilt alongside the cities themselves. This makes sense as a response to catastrophe. But the speed of institutional transformation raises questions similar to those raised by the speed of physical reconstruction. How were new insurance frameworks developed and implemented so quickly? How were they coordinated across cities, across states, across countries? The usual answer involves market forces. Demand created supply. Perhaps this is correct. But the uniformity of insurance documentation practices that emerged after 1871 suggests something more than spontaneous market response. It suggests planning. It suggests templates that existed before the events that supposedly necessitated them. I began examining architectural records from the post-fire period. In Chicago, Certain architectural firms received contracts to design multiple buildings in the burned district. These firms employed surprisingly standardized designs: windows of uniform dimension, floor plates of regular proportion, facade treatments that repeat across unrelated commissions. Architectural historians describe this as efficiency. In a reconstruction boom, standardization reduces costs and accelerates timelines. This explanation satisfies most inquiries. It satisfied mine initially. But then I noticed the same standardization appearing in reconstructed areas of other cities. Cities that burned in 1871. Cities that burned in other years. The aesthetic vocabulary of post-fire architecture begins to look less like independent response and more like coordinated implementation. The buildings look related. They look like they emerged from a shared source. This may be evidence of architectural influence spreading through normal professional channels. Or it may be evidence of something else. The street grids tell a similar story. Many cities that experienced significant fires in the 19th century emerge from reconstruction with rationalized street patterns. The organic medieval streets of Constantinople gave way to wider, straighter thoroughfares. The commercial district of Chicago shed its irregular lots in favor of a more uniform grid. Urban historians frame this as opportunistic improvement. Fire clears the existing fabric, allowing planners to impose order on chaos. But the consistency of the imposed order across disparate cities begins to suggest shared planning principles that predate the fires themselves. As if the fires enabled implementation of designs that already existed. As if destruction was a necessary precondition for a predetermined transformation. I want to be very careful here. The language of conspiracy is seductive because it promises coherence. It replaces the anxiety of randomness with the comfort of intention. Someone is in control. Events have meaning. The alternative, that history is chaos, that catastrophes cluster through probability rather than planning, is more difficult to accept. I am not offering you the comfort of coherence. I am presenting you with patterns that resist simple explanation. What you make of these patterns is your own responsibility. The Peshtigo Fire, the deadliest fire in American history, receives a few paragraphs in most historical treatments of the period. The Chicago Fire, which killed far fewer people, receives chapters. Why? The conventional explanation involves urban significance. Chicago was a major commercial center. Its destruction and reconstruction affected national economic networks. Peshtigo was a lumber town. Its destruction affected primarily its own residents. This explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The treatment of Peshtigo in historical memory suggests active de-emphasis rather than passive neglect. The attention directed at Chicago may have served to direct attention away from Peshtigo, away from the scale of regional destruction, away from the simultaneity that defies simple explanation. Consider what was lost in these fires. Not just buildings, not just lives, records, archives, municipal documents, property records, church records, birth certificates and death certificates, business ledgers. The documentary evidence of what existed before the fires was largely destroyed in the fires themselves. We know what came after because what came after produced new documentation. We know less about what came before because that evidence burned. This is usually described as historical loss, but it could also be described as historical clearance. The fires burned not just structures, but memory. They burned evidence. They burned the ability to verify what had existed, who had owned it, what claims might be made on reconstructed land and reconstructed institutions. I found references to fires in 1871 that I could not fully document. References in letters. References in diplomatic communications. References in shipping records noting delays due to fires at ports. These fragmentary references point toward events that should exist in more complete documentation, but do not. The fires are mentioned, but not described. They appear as context, but not as subject. I cannot tell you with certainty that these fires happened as described. I cannot tell you with certainty that they happened simultaneously with the North American events. What I can tell you is that the references exist, and the fuller documentation does not. Absence is not evidence, but a pattern of absences may be evidence of something. Of what, I cannot say. The rebuilding that followed 1871 shares features across continents that become more striking the more closely you examine them. The modern utilities installed simultaneously with reconstruction. Gas lines, water systems, telegraph infrastructure, street lighting. The rebuilt cities emerge not merely repaired, but upgraded. The disaster enables modernization at a pace that peacetime development would not permit. This pattern appears across multiple fires in multiple cities in multiple years, as if fire functions as a mechanism for urban transformation, as if destruction is a prerequisite for certain kinds of progress. I want to ask you a question without an answer. What would it mean if major urban fires of the 19th century were not random catastrophes, but coordinated resets? I am not claiming this is true. I am asking what it would mean. It would mean that the cities we inherited are not organic developments, but planned implementations. It would mean that the historical record was shaped by those who benefited from reconstruction. It would mean that what we remember was selected, and what we forgot was erased. It would mean that the architecture surrounding us, the street grids guiding our movement, the institutional frameworks structuring our society, emerged from planned demolition rather than gradual evolution. I am not claiming this. I am asking you to consider what it would mean. The tone of newspaper coverage shifts in the weeks following the 1871 fires. Initial reports communicate shock and grief. Later reports communicate optimism. The city will be rebuilt. The city will be better. The fire was tragic, but the future will justify the loss. This shift happens remarkably quickly. Within weeks, the narrative of renewal is already dominant. Within months, the fire is already being framed as a fortunate catastrophe. How does a population process such loss so quickly? How does collective memory reorganize itself around optimism within weeks of unprecedented destruction? The usual answer involves resilience, the human capacity to adapt and rebuild. Perhaps this is correct, but the uniformity of the optimistic turn across multiple cities experiencing fires in the same period begins to suggest something beyond spontaneous resilience. It begins to suggest managed narrative, someone deciding what the story would be before the story had finished happening. I cannot tell you what happened in October 1871. I can tell you that the story you inherited is simpler than the events it describes. I can tell you that fires burned simultaneously across distances that challenge explanation. I can tell you that documentation is missing in patterns that might be random and might not be. I can tell you that the cities rebuilt were different from the cities that burned, different in ways that suggest planning rather than recovery. I can tell you that institutional frameworks for insurance and construction emerged after the fires with suspicious speed and suspicious uniformity. I can tell you that what was lost in the fires included not just lives and property, but records, archives, evidence of what had existed before. What I cannot tell you is why. I cannot tell you who benefits from coordinated urban destruction. I cannot tell you how fires could be ignited simultaneously across hundreds of miles without modern communication. I cannot tell you whether the patterns I have observed are signals or noise. I can only tell you that the questions I began asking led to more questions, and the more questions I asked, the less satisfied I became with the answers available. The official story of the Great Chicago Fire is a story of accident and resilience. A cow, a lantern, a city that rose from ashes. It is a comforting story. It explains everything while explaining nothing. It provides closure where the evidence provides only fragments. What was removed in the fires of 1871? We know what burned. Buildings and bodies and documents. But what was removed? What was there before that could not coexist with what came after? What had to be erased so that the new order could be inscribed onto cleared ground? The fire did not merely destroy a city. It destroyed the possibility of knowing what that city had been. We study the Chicago that was rebuilt. We cannot study the Chicago that burned. The same applies to every city that experienced these coordinated catastrophes. We know the after. The before was taken from us. Perhaps all of this is coincidence. Perhaps simultaneous fires across a continent on a single October night in 1871 require no explanation beyond drought and wind and the fragility of wooden cities. Perhaps the speed of reconstruction reflects nothing more than American ambition and European capital. Perhaps the uniformity of post-fire architecture is simply efficiency. Perhaps the missing documentation was simply lost in the chaos of events. Perhaps the narrative compression of complex catastrophe into simple origin story is a natural function of memory. Perhaps I have found patterns where only randomness exists. This is possible. This may be the most reasonable interpretation of everything I have presented. But if that is true, then why does the pattern repeat? Why do major urban fires across the 19th century follow the same sequence of destruction, rapid reconstruction, modernization, narrative simplification, and archival loss? Why do cities emerge from fire looking more like each other than like themselves before the flames? Why does catastrophe consistently enable institutional transformation that peacetime would resist? Why does fire clear not only buildings, but memory? What burned in 1871 across 3 continents? And who decided what would rise from those ashes before the fires were even out?